I'm Grant Hardy, and you're listening to The Pulse on AMI Audio. On February 19th, 2025, a group of 11 major disability organizations held an all-candidates debate on disability issues for the 2025 Ontario election. Today, I will be speaking with David Lepofsky, chair of the AODA Alliance, one of the organizations who organized this debate. Plus, I'd like to welcome Jacob Shymanski to The Pulse. I live in BC. Jacob is here to provide his perspective as a resident of Ontario who lives with a disability. And now it's time to get to our interview. David, welcome to The Pulse.
Always happy to be here.
So let's just dive right in. Why was this such an important event to hold, and what was the turnout like?
Well, it's great to be here. Let me tell you, if you think about it, in a democracy, elections are the time when we get to have our direct say as voters. We choose, parties put their platforms forward and their records forward, and we look at them and say, who do we want? Our coalition and the other organizations that put this event together are all nonpartisan. We don't try to get anybody, we don't endorse any party or oppose any party. We try to get the strongest commitments for people with disabilities out of all the parties. And there are two important things when it comes to an election. One is, what are the parties actually promising? And number two, getting a chance as voters, face-to-face or virtually face-to-face, to be able to ask our questions. You know, why are you only promising X, not Y? How can we trust you to do this? And so on. So for those in power who are saying, elect us again, they also are putting their record on the line. They're saying, look at all the great stuff we did. But it's our opportunity, face-to-face, to get answers for that. And that's why any all-candidates debate matters, but it especially matters for people with disabilities because we have systemically faced barriers getting heard. So by organizing an event like this, it provides a platform to try to overcome those barriers. So we did it as a province-wide debate, not in one riding. We asked all the parties to send someone, and we said, you can pick who you send. And the idea is to provide that opportunity, but also with the benefit of Zoom, it means that people can attend and ask questions no matter where they are in the province, or no matter, how bad the snowstorm is in the province. In the case of this week. And it also means that we can archive it as we did, put it up online, and then people who weren't able to take part at the time could still watch it.
And we've had quite a big turnout already as of Friday, the 21st here. We've had several hundred people tune in.
Well, we've had at the event, either in person or online, we had over 500 people. I think it may have been 600. Actually, in the end, we don't have an exact number of how many were in the room. But since then, we posted the video online on Thursday afternoon, the day after, and in about 24 hours, it's got another 700 views. So wow. It's still going up. So what that means, and you don't get a view on YouTube, from what I understand, unless somebody watches the whole darn thing. So what that means is this, when I've gone to all candidates debates in my own riding in past years, there's, 50, 70 on a really good day, maybe 100 people there. This is an audience of 1,200. This is huge.
I'll also add, it's Jacob, by the way, happy to be here. Hi, Grant. Hi, David. I'll also add that the people who ask questions to the candidates, be that in person or on Zoom, their questions were very well thought out. And you could tell that people cared about this issue specifically. And what was being discussed quite a bit was ODSP and the proposed doubling of its value and indexing it to inflation. Now, this was an all candidates debate, but we had one party that wasn't represented there. They were invited. That was the PCs. David, what do you make of that? What are we supposed to make of that?
Well, here's the thing. When I did my introduction at the start of the event, I said that we have to commend candidates for having the courage to put themselves and their records on the line and to face our questions. And for the New Democrats and the Greens and the Liberals who sent representatives, they all were prepared to have that courage. The Conservative Party, which is the party that is in power, which did not have to have an election for another year and a half, which overrode the fixed date election by requirements in the law by calling this election, they're saying it's so important to for us to get reelected that we want to put our record on the line now. And yet they weren't there. Now, again, we're not there to support or oppose any party, but we can identify where the different parties stand on things, and voters can make up their own mind. What compounds this are a couple of things. One is the minister who's had responsibility for accessibility for people with disabilities and seniors throughout the 6.5 years that the government's been in power is Raymond Cho, and he's in Toronto. He's actually the longest serving minister with this file in Ontario history. He's been responsible for the Disabilities Act for 1/3 of the 20 years, which was mandated by the legislature to make the province accessible. And yet he did not come to defend his record or his government's record or to say what they would do next if reelected. And the final thing I want to say about this, well, actually two other things. Back on the 6th of January, our coalition held a news conference at Queen's Park that got a lot of media attention. And at it, we unveiled the commitments we were seeking from the parties on accessibility. Now, there are other issues, not just tearing down disability barriers, but the one that we're responsible for advocating on, accessibility. We laid out a 10-plank platform, which we call the Accessible Ontario Pledge. 3 of the parties have responded to it, either making the entire pledge or making substantially, the body of things we were asking for. And one party has not responded, and that is the Conservative Party. So if you total it up, they're not prepared to answer our request for commitments. They're not prepared to come and defend their record. They're not prepared to say what they're prepared to do. And they're not prepared to respond to what the other parties have to say.
Not a good look.
I think it's for the voters to decide on all that. But I said I had 2 things. The other thing I wanted to tell you is we kept trying to get them to answer. We're still trying to get them to answer the Accessible Ontario Pledge. And the moment they do, we will make that public with all of our other updates. But I was even on the radio. I was on CBC just a couple of hours before this debate, talking about the debate and saying the Tories have not responded. And I said, we'll have a chair for you. We want, even if you just walk in at the last minute, we really want you there. And in the spirit of nonpartisanship. And I said, basically, if there are any Tories out there, call your party and get them to send someone.
Yeah, it's very odd messaging to be sort of quote unquote brave enough to call an election early, to be in power now and not to be willing to make that representation. Kind of curious also about what the tone has been like from participants with disabilities since those Queen's Park hearings. Maybe people attending the debate, asking questions. Is the tone getting a little more frustrated, or how would you describe it?
No, I'll tell you this. It was really interesting. What you're referring to, for the benefit of our listeners, is back on November 25th, we staged what we call community public hearings at the Ontario Legislature to mark the 30th anniversary of the birth of the movement campaigning for a Disabilities Act in Ontario. Normally you go to legislature and it's the politicians holding public hearings, but in this case we organized them, and we invited representatives from all the parties. And in this case, all four parties sent representatives to listen to our people making their presentations. And people making their presentations, talking about the barriers they face, were impassioned. It was such a Canadian event. They were impassioned. There was a lot of emotion. But they were also, it was a really dignified and respectful process. And when it came to the all candidates debate this past week, I would say the same things about it. It's not that people are making light of the issues, much the contrary, but they really were presenting them in a mature and respectful way, but not pulling their punches on their emotion.
I want to bring up this doubling of the ODSP benefit because the Greens, the NDP, and the Liberals are all proposing some form of doubling the ODSP. We haven't heard much from the PCs about this. Why is this important? Because doubling it sounds like a lot. Doubling the budget of anything sounds like a lot.
Well, let me explain first for the benefit of those who are not in Ontario or don't know the lingo. ODSP is the Ontario Disability Support Program. Back around under 30 years ago, when we last had a Conservative government in Ontario under Mike Harris, they reinvented the social assistance, or what used to be called welfare, and they created a separate stream, if you will, or a separate benefit package for people with disabilities living in poverty, called the Ontario Disability Support Plan, or ODSP. It has always been well below the poverty line. Mm-hmm. So the term that disability income and poverty advocates use is it's legislated poverty. It's a law that essentially locks you into poverty. Unless you could get a job, but we face barriers in education. You can't get a good job if you can't get a good education. And we face barriers in the workplace, and the unemployment rate facing people with disabilities is much higher than facing the general public. So, in the face of that, we've been facing this legislative poverty situation. And in fact, just before the last election in 2022, the Doug Ford Tories, if memory serves, released a budget, but didn't provide for, I think, any ODSP increase, or if there was, it was way too low. I think there wasn't any. And then this came up as an issue on the campaign trail right away. And all of a sudden, if memory serves, the government found some money and raised ODSP by a certain number of percentage points. Nothing dramatic. And when you're living in that degree of poverty, listen, every dollar helps. But in this case, what's really significant now is that all three opposition parties have said they're going to double it. And that would be a very significant increase relative to what people are receiving now. This is important from a couple of perspectives beyond the obvious. One is I've been on AMI talking about over the past years the Canada Disability Benefit. Justin Trudeau promised it in 2020. Legislation wasn't passed for 3 years. We still haven't seen a dime of it flow. But while it was promised to lift people with disabilities out of poverty, it's going to not lift the vast majority of impoverished people with disabilities out of poverty, because the maximum people can get under it is about $200 a month.
Wow.
So in comparison, this provincial change, if it becomes law, would be very dramatic. So that's important. And the coalition I serve, the AODA Alliance, we were united with a number of disability groups saying that the Canada Disability Benefit Act needed to be amended because otherwise we could end up with people left in poverty. It was so vague, it really left it to Cabinet to decide how much or how little to give. And a number of disability organizations agreed with us, but there were some who said, oh, no, don't amend it at all. Don't amend it. Just pass it as it is. And we warned a number of us that if you pass the weak bill as it was written, there was a real risk that the benefit was going to be grossly inadequate. Well, what happened is those who said the bill got passed substantially as originally written. There were a few minor amendments, but not, and they're helpful, but not anywhere near the ones we needed to ensure the benefit would be sufficient to live up to the federal government's rhetoric. Now, of interest, a number of the organizations that said back then, don't amend it, are now saying the benefit is too low. Well, but anyway, so all of this fits together to tell you that there is an interplay of how these issues operate federally and provincially. But an increase that would double the benefit would be a substantial improvement.
Can you give me an idea for someone in Vancouver where our disability rate, I mean, absolutely, don't even think you could pay for rent or groceries at the same time. If they doubled the ODSP, what sort of amount are we talking about? Would it be reasonably outside the poverty level? Or?
Okay, I don't have the numbers on that.
No worries.
Just in fairness, the AODA, there are fantastic advocates who are leading the campaign for livable income for people with disabilities and poverty. Yeah. But I will tell you that I understand the figures now are, and I could be off by $100, but are in the range of $1,300 a month. And so if that doubled to $2,600 a month, that would be, that's more than a trivial increase.
Yeah, I'll say.
By the way, the other thing I should tell you that I kind of adverted to before is Ontario's in a deficit position right now. And while this election is going on, everyone in Ontario is receiving a $200 check from the Ontario government. Right. And not for anything. They're just writing checks that happen to come during an election campaign. And we're in a deficit, so they got to borrow money to pay this money. And so it's particularly important to think about disability poverty at a time when a government can decide to just hand over that money at this time.
Really?
That's what voters have to look at and decide what they want to do about it.
And just to bring a little bit of clarification for anyone who's to who these policies are new, ODSP is in Ontario. The Canada Disability Benefit is federal. So ODSP
will be federal.
It's supposed the CDB is federal.
Right. And the idea that the federal government said is they knew that all the provincial social assistance for people with disabilities is legislated poverty. So they wanted to come up with a federal benefit that would top it up and take you at least supposedly over the poverty line, though they don't guarantee that it will. And at the numbers they're proposing, for the vast majority of people, it won't.
But so I do want to touch on the fact that 3 of the opposition parties right now are saying that they're going to do this to double the ODSP amount. That's remarkable. How did that happen? Like, why is it that it's in this election cycle that this political will came about? Like, where did this come from?
You know what? I can't answer that. Okay, seriously, because it's a question of what their own decisions internally. But I think the case for the unfairness of disability poverty is overwhelming. We know that when they make these kind of payments, people really are lifted out of poverty, and that money then flows right back into the economy by additional demand for very essential things like food and shelter, and it can help get people off the streets who are living homeless. So
there's a knock-on.
There's so many benefits to not only to the people languishing in poverty, but to the rest of society.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was just chuckling there because it is funny. It's a odd political will to have all of a sudden over multiple parties, and then to have the party in power not talking about that at all. It's an interesting dynamic, that's for sure.
Well, there was also an amazing dynamic at Queen's Park, and I'm just going from memory of a news article I read a month ago or so, but a former member of the legislature went public in the media that he was homeless. He had gotten very ill and ended up losing everything, I guess, he had, and was living homelessly. And he was just trying to get back on his feet. And he went public with the kind of message that this could happen to anyone. And what do you know, a number of members in the legislature from all parties kind of took up collections for him to help him get back on his feet, which is great for one person. But social assistance is doing that like for all the people living in poverty.
Yeah, it's pretty frustrating that at the same time people are both criticizing you for not getting a job and going to work, while at the same time they're literally like pushing people out of work with barriers that people are putting up.
Well, there are barriers to get into work, and having battled to tear down barriers in the education system, which preclude you from getting the absolute essentials to be able to qualify for a job, and then barriers to getting competitive employment after that. And these all trace to failings on the part of successive governments to effectively implement the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act.
Right.
Because if they were tearing down those education barriers, transportation barriers, workplace barriers, and so on, we could be a lot further ahead. And we were supposed to be, we were guaranteed by legislation that we would be a lot further ahead. Now, the important question really is, what can people listening to us do about this during an election? And the answer is a lot. And if our listeners go to our website, which is AODAalliance.org, and if you just go to the What's New page, you'll see that the top posts are all about our advocacy during the election. We've put out what we asked for from the parties. We've put out updates that list what the parties have committed, but we also put out an action kit with ready-to-use tips that you can use right from your home to raise these issues. Now, if you're in Ontario, please help. If you're outside Ontario, please reach out to people you know in Ontario and please help. And finally, if you are outside Ontario, you will have elections coming soon, and we're expecting a federal one. And all of these strategies are useful in any election. So we're trying to empower people with disabilities. And again, we're nonpartisan. We're not saying who to vote for. We're saying get active to help raise disability issues. And it's important to take these action tips because one of the really frustrating things that we've found, and I've been involved in raising disability issues in provincial elections for 30 years now, and I've seen a pattern. Leading up to the election, we often can get a good amount of media coverage about disability issues. But as soon as the campaign starts, it's like somebody at Media Central turns the tap off. And it is extremely hard. I won't say impossible, but extremely hard. So we have to depend on individuals, like those listening to us, to talk to voters who are friends of theirs or family members, and essentially play the role that I wish the mainstream media was. Now, I can tell you, having talked to a number of reporters in the major news outlets, I'm not saying all of them have done no coverage, but I'm telling you that it is brutally hard to get the coverage. What I found is now they're telling me, I've heard over and over, this is newsworthy, we're not covering this. But we just don't have the staff. Our staff are shrinking. People are on holidays and so on. And that's the reality we face. So we need you to pick up the slack that they're leaving. Because voters don't, if they don't hear about it from the media, what they'll hear from the media is what the polls say and they'll tell us who's winning or who they think is likely to win or who's likely to lose and how it's a foregone conclusion and so on.
And I find that really frustrating.
And every time I see an article about polls, I said that could have been spaced and devoted to our issues, but the people whose opinions are being expressed in those polls haven't heard about our issues. And that's not democracy. That's not the way democracy is supposed to work.
David, do you mind giving us a little outline of what some of the promises are that the parties are making?
Well, I'll give you some. I can't give you anything from the Conservatives because they didn't come. But I'll give you some. Obviously, you heard doubling the disability support plan. I'd say all of them, or most of them, if not all of them, and I wasn't carefully scribing this information, but acknowledged that people with disabilities and poverty face other barriers, not just the dollar amount. And they committed to address that. On the key issue of implementing the Disabilities Act, they all made commitments on tearing down accessibility barriers. They all agree that we need more accessibility standards enacted. They all agree that we need effective enforcement. They all agree that we need some kind of strategy for accessible housing. And so across the board in those areas, and they recognized areas like education and healthcare are particularly important, not only to everybody else, but to us especially. And the other thing that came up, and selfishly I asked this question, which is, I said, one party's going to win and the others are going to lose, and they're going to be in opposition. It could be a majority government or a minority government. But either way, we want to know if these parties will essentially drop their partisanship when it comes to us and work together, whether they're in government or they're in opposition. And we got a positive response from these parties. And I will tell you, this is what's really interesting. The atmosphere at the debate was actually pretty nonpartisan from the candidates. Now, they are competing for each other, and they did say, here's why I think my party's the best one, and that's, of course, what they're supposed to say. Mm-hmm. But there wasn't crossfire.
Yeah, they mostly agree with each other.
Mm-hmm. Whether they just decided that, this audience wouldn't be interested or whatever. But I would say there was a feeling among those of us watching that the candidates were speaking, the representatives were speaking to the issues, and not, taking shots at each other. Now, it might have been different if a Tory had shown up, because they might have had some tough words for them, and that's fair game. But I'm just saying, and this is important because if whoever wins the election, and whether or not they have a majority, there are lots of things that we could try to do through advocacy efforts at the legislature, and we'd rather have parties that we can coordinate with together.
Mm-hmm. Folks, you're listening to The Pulse, still speaking with David Lepofsky, chair of the AODA Alliance. Jacob Shymanski is with me. Jacob.
If I can bring it back to the AODA and how its implementation has been delayed, non-existent, depends how you want to put it. There was a weird exchange at the debate at the Bloor Hospital that happened a couple of days ago, where the candidates were asked how you can enforce the AODA, because that's been a huge problem of why it's been implemented so slowly. Like, in a perfect world, how do you actually enforce the AODA? And I'm only asking you because the candidates were pretty wishy-washy and did not go into specifics. They just said, absolutely, yes, it's important. Obviously, it's important, but how?
Yeah, so there are several things. And our Accessible Ontario Pledge documents the specifics we're asking for, but also if you go to our website at aodaalliance.org/enforcement, you'll see our efforts and our proposals in the past. So there are several things. One of which is the government needs to audit. They need to audit on site, and they have that authority. The current government and the one before it, under the Liberals, they didn't audit on site. They would simply, their idea of an audit was to say, oh, you're supposed to keep records of what you're doing about accessibility. Show us your records. And if the records are good enough, that's fine. And if not, we'll tell you to improve your records. Well, I don't care about their files. I care about their premises, their services, and so on. So that power is in the Act. There's the power to issue compliance orders. If you are in non-compliance, they can issue an order that tells you what you got to do and when you got to do it by. Precious few of those are issued. If an organization gets a compliance order and doesn't comply within the prescribed timelines, there's a power to impose monetary penalties, and they can be very substantial. Well, when we last checked, which was a few years ago, there were maybe 5 penalties issued in 5 years, and they were all paltry. I mean, the message is clear to obligated organizations that there is no risk in noncompliance. So all of these are powers that could be used, but and should be used effectively. But one of the other ideas that we've come up with is not just to have inspectors deputized under the Act, like hiring a certain number of AODA inspectors, but the government can deputize inspectors under other legislation with an AODA mandate. So if you're inspecting a restaurant for food safety, or building code compliance, or occupational health and safety inspection, we can deputize them with an AODA mandate. So once they're in the premises, they can have a short AODA checklist to look around and deal with. And if obligated organizations know that if a wide range of different inspectors enter their premises for a wide range of different reasons, they also have an AODA checklist, you better believe they're going to take this legislation more seriously.
You know, I'm just curious, David, more generally, it's pretty cool that this debate was organized and took place, even if one party, the majority of parties showed up prepared, and that's pretty cool. How can we ensure that these kinds of debates happen consistently, not only in all the provinces, but for the federal government as well?
Well, this is the responsibility of the community. There's nothing in law that said there shall be all candidates debates of any sort. In your riding, wherever you live, if there is one, it's because your local, some community organization or a church group or business association decide to convene one, and they organize it often at the last minute, and they invite the candidates to come, and the candidates have to scramble from one to the next, and so on. In this case, normally when there's a fixed term election, or community organizations have a lot of lead time. You could know 5 months in advance, reach out to other groups, divide up the work. In this case, what happened was a group of us started working together very quickly to pull together an event, a debate. And then I happened to find out that another group of disability organizations were doing the same thing at the same time. So I called up one of the people from their group. And because everybody's slapping this thing together really fast, I said, why don't we work together? And everybody said, absolutely. And we got on a Zoom call, and we had this fantastic collaboration with one organization arranging attendant care, another organization providing the premises, another one providing the sign language and captioning, and so on. It was just an incredible, and another one, writing the news release and stuff, collaboration. And then it got pulled together, and it happened. And I can tell you, we're going to want to do this again at the federal level. There are incredible logistic challenges. We had it in person and on Zoom, and the intent was to have the Zoom live streamed. But the live stream on our YouTube channel just didn't work. It was tested out by some of our volunteers. multiple times to be sure it worked. And then when they hit the stream button, it didn't happen. So we had to wait a day
Of course.
to put it up online, and we're getting those views now. But anyway, so if anybody hearing this interview thinks it's worth doing, just get some people together. If you're connected with an organization, it's great if you pull together a couple. What ends up happening is a few people do kind of the heavy lifting in terms of coordinating things. But then we had a list of, 11 or 12 organizations who were listed as co-sponsoring. Now, that's not writing checks and stuff. It's just, it was part of a collect. And the message to the candidates is, and the public, that there's a large group of people here working together on this.
And there's a lot of parties working on doubling the ODSP, right? And I keep going back to this because this is the biggest deal coming out of this debate. It was almost the reason, like the impetus for gathering it in the first place, if I understood correctly. Now, another topic that was brought up by the debate that I thought was really interesting, especially when you consider that the PCs and Doug Ford are still pretty firmly in the lead in the polls, is how can you affect change if you're the opposition party? And I'd like to ask you that question directly, David. What's your perspective on that?
Well, there's several things that happen because we've worked with governments, we've worked with opposition parties, we've worked with opposition parties when the government is committed to us, we've worked with the opposition parties when the government's not. I can tell you that when the AODA was brought before the legislature to be passed in 2005 by the Dalton McGuinty Liberals, they had been in opposition at first. And they were sold on the importance of the issue. And when they saw the Mike Harris Tories in the 90s promise us legislation but deliver a bill that was laughably weak, the Liberals were like chomping at the bit to get into power to do things, and this was one of them. And they were very excited when they got into power, and they did it. I remember the day the bill got introduced for first reading and they had a little gathering to celebrate. One of the senior cabinet ministers who had approached us early on when they were in opposition and said to me, "This is what I went into public life for, like to make things better." Mm-hmm. Now, that's from what I believe, Liberals, Conservatives, Greens, NDP, that's what they all are there for. They have different visions of how to do it, but they're all there for that reason. So when they're in opposition, it becomes an opportunity to get them excited about an issue and fluent with an issue. And sometimes they can, through question period and other actions, broker some improvements. Now, if the government becomes a majority government, the opposition could do less. But I got to tell you, when Dalton McGuinty got elected, the Conservatives, who, while in power, were not prepared to pass strong legislation, only weak legislation. When they got into opposition, they were prepared to push the Liberals to make amendments to strengthen the Liberal bill at our request. So there are times and also there's, when they're in opposition, it's always about building relationships. Mm-hmm. I mean, the leader of the NDP right now, and we're prepared to work with any of them, is Marit Stiles. Well, I first met her in the 90s when she was a staffer in the NDP research office and had our file. And so that's how we first got to know each other, and that's how she first got to know the file. So you build those kind of relationships with any and all of the parties that are prepared to work with you. And the final thing I'll tell you is if there is a minority government, there's, of course, tons you can do with the opposition because they have a majority of seats in the legislature. So, like, when I asked the question about the opposition parties, about the current opposition parties, would you be prepared to work together on our issues? That would be especially important if Ford gets reelected with a minority and we have an opportunity to coordinate with the opposition using their majority of votes to possibly move some things forward.
Another area where I think a lot of progress needs to be made is in housing. And that was the first topic that was brought up at the debate. specifically the lack of accessible housing. Now, housing affects everybody, be it if you have a disability or if you don't. The question is, people who have a disability are disproportionately under the poverty line compared to the rest of the population. When you address things like housing, that's helping everybody, including the disability community. So where do you draw the line in terms of what legislation you want to promote when between things that address disability issues and things that address, things like wealth inequality and things like that?
Well, here's the thing. I don't think there's a line you've got to draw.
You can do both.
The fact is, everybody needs a place to live.
Right.
Yep.
And everybody at some point in their life is going to need accessible housing. Okay. As you get older, it's harder to walk upstairs. So if every house is built with 4 steps in the front, because somehow somebody thought that was how houses have to be designed.
Or it just looks better.
Right. This is a problem. Now, when my wife and I were shopping for a house 20 years ago, I went through a lot of houses. And thank God, we could afford to buy one. But I went into some nice houses, and it was some older folks who were living there. And I'd always say, why are you moving out? It's such a nice house. And they'd say, I can't handle the stairs. And I looked for a house which I could create level access to. And also, if I ever need to put in an elevator, there's a place in the house that where one could be put. Now, I got to tell you, I think if you have a house with an elevator today, and I know some people who do, that house is going to be pretty valuable on the market as our society ages. But
Right.
it isn't just houses. I was interviewed on CBC a couple of months ago. They came to us with a story where a woman lived in a condo, an elderly woman, and her daughter was coming to visit her daily to assist her. And the daughter had a service animal, not a guide dog, but a service animal. And the condo passed a bylaw or some policy that said that every time you brought the dog in, it had to be registered, and they had to carry them in a container through the public areas. Like, this stuff is all flamingly contrary to the Human Rights Code. And this woman was protesting. Well, this is another barrier to accessible housing. It's not a flight of stairs, but it's just another kind of impediment that this person had to lawyer up and fight about. It was this affects everybody. Also, even if you don't have a disability, you will have friends and family who do, and you're going to want to visit them. If you've got a disability, and let's say you've got an adult child who starts a family, and you want to go visit your grandkids, if you can't get in the house or you can't use the bathroom, it's going to be harder to visit.
Yeah,
so it cuts across everybody.
There's definitely a strong social license to provide the supports that seniors need and that kind of retrofit. There's an intersectionality, but there's an intersection between aging and disability, because the older you get, the more likely you are to acquire a disability. I think a lot of people neglect, right?
Yeah, absolutely. No, I mean, we are the minority of everybody. So if you look at house construction, when you are moving around a big city, you'll see new houses under construction. Now, I think in a lot of cases, it's not like a family bought the property and then designed the house and brought in a builder. It's the builder who decided to buy the property, build a house, and then try to sell it. Now, if our accessibility legislation and building code required certain basic accessibility features to be built in to make the house accessible, visitable, and easily, you may not want to have grab bars in the bathroom, but they're roughed in so somebody can add them if they need them. And in that event, we would have more new housing on the market at no public expense. If you design it in, it's not a cost. It's not an appreciable increase, if any increase in the cost of the constructing the house. But we could be significantly increasing our supply of accessible housing. But we're not.
Even if we know that the demographics are heavily shifting, right?
Yeah.
Grant?
It's very interesting. It's very unfortunate. And hopefully we'll continue to see those perspectives shift as we move along. One of the big questions that somehow I find and maybe others, hopefully it's not just me, are still very uninformed about is how can we vote accessibly in this election in particular?
Well, it's funny you would mention that, because I have a complaint at the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario against Elections Ontario on that very issue. There are barriers that can face different voters with different disabilities. For example, the government decided to call this snap election in the middle of February, which last time I checked, predictably has snowstorms.
So much snow
in
right
Toronto, we've right now got 4 and 5 feet of snow piled up on walking paths, making a lot of the area impossible to travel if you use a mobility device like a wheelchair or if you use a cane, a white cane. Well, this is going to make it harder to get to the polls, or impossible for some people to get to the polls. The other options that we're offered to vote have problems. Having someone mark your ballot. The secret ballot requires you to be able to independently mark your own ballot in private 100%. By yourself and verify that it's marked the way you wanted it to be. Well, if you have somebody else marking your ballot for you, you're not doing it yourself. It's not secret. And you can't verify your choice. You don't know if they did what you asked them to do. You don't know if they screwed up. They have a template that you overlay with, I think, Braille numbers, if I recall correctly, next to the holes. And then they tell you which number corresponds to which candidate. But again, if you mark it, you don't know whether it was lined up properly on the ballot. You don't know whether it actually marked the candidate you wanted. You don't know if you accidentally spoiled it by having your pencil or whatever mark outside.
Right, because the person who works at the polling station doesn't necessarily know how to read Braille, so how are they supposed to line it up?
Well, it's not just that. There's. I don't know if they need to read Braille, but in any event, it's
hard to trust it. Like, it's just hard when it's...
Yeah, no, I've got you. But the other option they offer, they call the accessible voting machine, where you put on a pair of headphones and you press some buttons to have it read you your choices, press a button to make your choice, press a button, print, and then you can have it scan it. But in the problem with this is it does not consistently and reliably work. Oh. I used it in the 2011 and 2014 elections, and it worked. In the 2018 election, I used it, and the ballot ended up, I'm just summarizing, I'm not giving it event by event, but the ballot ended up on the floor, and the poll worker bent over to pick it up and saw who I voted for.
Yeah.
And I'm not for a moment suggesting that the poll worker meant or was trying to do that. But it doesn't matter from my point of view. My secret ballot was not a secret ballot. So when you use this machine, you'd never know in advance whether you're going to be able to independently mark your ballot in private and verify your choice, or whether your ballot's going to end up with a problem, like mine. So I've got a case under the Human Rights Code. I filed it in 2019 against Elections Ontario. The CNIB and the Alliance for Equality of Blind Canadians have both intervened in the proceedings as interveners, and as I understand it, supporting my position. The case is going to a hearing this September, which is 6 years after I filed the complaint, which is due to the exceptional and inexcusable delays at the tribunal.
Well, you did say that the work that you do takes years and years, right? Case in point.
But by the way, the options for voting depend on which level of government, not just which province you're in, but federally, they haven't used one of these machines. Municipally in Ontario or in Toronto, they do. It's a different machine, if I recall correctly. And in some parts of the country at some times, some municipalities have allowed for internet or telephone voting, which would allow you to independently market by yourself in private and verify your choice, and would save you the ordeal of having to climb over 6 foot or 5 foot snow mountains to get to the polling station. Oh, by the way, I'm not going through all the other voting options. Elections Ontario will say, oh, you've got an option to vote at home. But again, voting at home with a ballot where you've got to have somebody else mark your ballot for you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of interesting. Absolutely not to say that any of this is intentional, but it is sort of interesting how minority groups tend to get into this very consistently, just very consistent barriers that kind of all sort of line up at once. Like, we just happen to have an election with some individuals who are not participating in the discussion about accessibility, which was called by those individuals, which is at a time where people with disabilities are going to struggle to get to the polls. Just very interesting how all those elements line up.
Yeah, no, I'm not a conspiracy theorist.
No,
but
absolutely.
It's more a matter of we just face barriers.
Frustrating.
Very often in different walks of life at the same time.
Jacob, David, is there anything either of you would like to add that we haven't covered?
The only other thing I want to just say to our listeners is this. If you'd like to learn more about this, if you want to see how we're doing this advocacy here in Ontario, I want to invite you to sign up to get our email updates. We sometimes have them a couple times a week, during the election a lot more, other times a year less. But all you got to do is go to our website, www.aodaalliance.org, aodaalliance.org. And right on the homepage, right near the top, you'll see an option to sign up to get our newsletter. You click on it, you type in your email address, and you confirm, and that's it. And if you do that, you will get the latest breaking news on all of these issues. And we've got web pages off of our homepage to read about barriers in employment, education, healthcare, the electoral process. You can just go to our What's New page and just see what's new, just generally. And so there's a lot there, but I'm going to encourage you to do that. And if you're on Twitter, I don't call it X, you can follow us at AODA Alliance, and please retweet our tweets. We're very busy on this stuff, and we like your help spreading the word.
I'd like to add that, we did talk about how voting in these elections, the accessibility of it will not be guaranteed. Please make an effort. It's still very important. Let your voice be heard. Guys, thank you so much.
And if you encounter barriers in voting, it's important to, in Ontario, write Elections Ontario or federally Elections Canada, or whoever your voting authority is, and report specifically what happened. I mean, I know that I'm not the only one who's had problems with this voting machine over the years. So, it's important that these experiences be documented.
Absolutely. And completely agree with Jacob as well. It's super frustrating sometimes, easier to just, I'm going to forgo my vote today, but it's really, really, really important if you're able to get out there to participate in the political process. David, really appreciate the work that you are doing, and Jacob, really appreciate you joining us as well to share your perspective as an Ontarian. Thanks, guys.
It's an honor to be
thanks,
here.
man.
Take care.